And this is Jerry Ashton with 15 Minutes of Fact coming to you from New York City and online with my next interviewee who will be talking to us from Portland, Oregon. The subject is going to be why prisons are so profitable and why the Occupy movement needs to stand up for prisoner rights. So we're going to be interviewing a gentleman by the name of Ashjamu Umi, who is an author, an occupier, and a prison's rights advocate and activist. So after my hosting an interview with a participant in the Occupy San Quentin protest late last month, I decided to do a bit more research on the subject that few people even realize to be necessary to discuss. And that's the prison industrial complex that has grown to huge size here in the United States over the past 2 decades. Now, what could be more or so complicated about jailing people for proven offenses? I mean, it sounds very simple. You do the wrong thing, you do the crime, you do the time, right? Well, unfortunately, the profit motive has entered, and that sets in a whole different set of dynamics. So rather than my going into detail on this, we're going to start out by asking a few questions of Ashjamu Umi. When I searched out a worthy subject to talk to about this particular continuation of the subject of prisoner rights, I went to a website called portlandoccupier.org and a lead article which I had to stop and read by occupier activist Ashjamu Umi, and that subject title was Why Prison is So Profitable. So someone who was born and raised in the inner city of San Francisco, who's fought his own background and all odds to earn a master's degree and become a determined social activist in the United States, Africa, and the Caribbean, and Europe. Someone who's worked with villagers, trade union workers, gang members, elderly women, students, practically every segment of society with one common goal, and that is positive social change. So spend the next 15 minutes with I've got to have more coffee in the morning, Ashjamu. Spend the next 15 minutes with me as we discuss this phenomenon of a burgeoning prison system problem, how it relates to a continuation of social inequality, and what effect the Occupy movement may have on its future. So welcome to the show today, Ashjamu.
Hello.
We're so happy to have you with us. So obviously,
happy to be here.
Well, the first thing is obviously, who are you and why are you saying those things? So let's start about a little bit about your background and how you got involved with this particular subject, and of course with the Occupy movement. So that's your cue. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, like you said, Jerry, I mean, all of my adult life, I've been an organizer in a Pan-African revolutionary political party called the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, and I'm still very much a member of that group today. And that spurred all of my activity. And basically the foundation around that is struggling for African or black self-determination wherever we are in the world. And that struggle is opened up to all of the people in the world who are struggling for social justice. And the whole question of prisons, of course, is part of that struggle. And then in terms of being an author, that's just another effort on my part to try to get the word to people about what type of world we want to live in.
Well, I guess I could start out with a question coming from my own orientation, or that is my own background. Doesn't the term black nationalists sort of frighten away white bread like me, middle Americans, who aren't quite sure what you mean by that?
Yeah, but we wouldn't consider ourselves black nationalists. We would call ourselves African nationalists, and the difference is our objective is tied to the land base of Africa and isn't tied to any race or ethnicity. So, we work quite closely with many white revolutionaries throughout the world, and have a wide-ranging relationship with activists and revolutionaries from all different backgrounds. So, our struggle is a little bit different. I mean, we can't identify with the quote unquote black nationalist movement because we relate and work with people based on their political interests, not their skin color or anything of that nature.
Well, that would bring me, of course, to Occupy. Occupy presumes not to have a political preference, although we do understand that there are identities in the national political scene that anyone in Occupy can identify with more and some less. So how did you get involved with Occupy, and how does that reflect on the work that you do as a person who's involved in prison reform?
Well, and this kind of ties in to what I just said. I mean, I moved here to Portland not knowing anybody, working on finishing my novel, and saw Occupy spring up last October, and needing to develop a political base here, got involved in it, and it was actually Occupy activists, white Occupy activists, that have given me quite a few contacts in the African or Black community that I've begin to work with as well. So, I'm actually facilitating a group called Occupy Northeast, the Black Working Group, which is a Black group in Portland here that is in solidarity with the Occupy movement. So, again, I think it's all one and the same at the end result. I mean, we're all fighting for political, economic, and social justice, and Occupy or the AAPRP, all of these are vehicles to get there.
Well, I think that's one of the important things for the listener to hear, not the listener who already is in the choir, but people who are sincerely seeking out an understanding of what Occupy is all about. Just how is it that people of color and Europeans, and frankly, by extension, my friends in the American Indian community, what is it that we share in common that goes past our differences? And even the idea of sharing something in common would include people from the right wing who share certain things, beliefs in common with us, people from the Tea Party who have complaints but maybe not quite centered where you and I would put them. So the idea of having a shared outcome, that seems to be the motivator for people involved in the Occupy movement. Am I correct on that?
Absolutely. And I think that, from my standpoint, the capitalist system it's exploitative of everybody. And I think for people of color, and we felt that sting a lot longer and a lot sharper. So what the Occupy movement for me represents is a broadening of that perspective and that consciousness, and an opportunity for us to begin, for really the first concrete time in history, to work together across these community lines to solve this problem.
Well, one of the things I enjoy in my research about you was going to your website, which is abetterworld.me, which features you, a lot of information about you, a lot of information about the book that you've written. But you have a quote there I particularly enjoy. I don't see disagreement as a negative, because I understand that Frederick Douglass was correct when he said, there is no progress without struggle. Our brains are muscles. Just like any other muscle in our body, if we don't stress it and push it, the brain will not improve. Or, as a bumper sticker I saw once put it, if you can't change your mind, how do you know it's there?
Right.
So are you changing any minds?
Absolutely. Every day. I mean, that's the whole focus of it. Like I said, I mean, my politics are revolutionary. So I think in a society like this one, a well-organized capitalist society, having a revolutionary consciousness, it's really incumbent upon you to understand how that happens. You don't have revolution without revolutionaries. So the way that happens is constant political education, which is lacking in America. So, my task is to win hearts and minds of people, to engage in constant educational campaigns, to educate people about the prison industrial complex, to educate people about the police complex, to educate people about healthcare industry and all of these things, and how they need to engage themselves in those processes to create institutions that can represent their interests, as opposed to having what we have now, which represents interests of a small, select group of multinational corporations.
Well, we're back to the stark reality of the 1% versus the 99%, and people do need to be educated out of complacency. Right.
Exactly, and that's the main aspect of it. I mean, there's a misconception people have about revolution, that it's it's a violent act, and revolution is happening right now with this interview. It's about challenging people to expand their thinking, and to not think that the paradigm that we're functioning under now, like the two-party system, is the only option we have, which is what most people in America believe, and it's not true. And that's that's the revolution, is getting people to think beyond that and seeing that, hey, I can contribute to creating the type of society I want. I don't just have to sit here and do whatever the Republicans tell me to do.
Well, one of the things that I would suggest to add to our conversation, Jamu, is the fact that there's something called activism that, for a lot of people, must precede true revolutionary thought or action. So the idea of people becoming educated is key. So let's jump into this subject of big money and big prisons. And I want to state some information here that seems to be kind of depressing to me, and that is, in a time of reduced crime overall in this country, it looks like prisons are becoming largely corporatized as opposed to being owned by states, and that in the agreements that states sign with corporations that will run prisons, they actually will guarantee a 90% occupancy. Now, you and I would have to listen to the truth that you get the behavior you reward, and if you reward states for occupying prisons, that means there's a hungry desire for prisoners, and that means that's going to impact a lot more people than the black and Hispanic community. Not that a lot of whites are not in prison, but there's an insatiable monster out there, and I'd like to have you describe that to us.
Right. Well, I think the way the system works is, like you just alluded to, there is a tremendous profit margin in prison labor because, unlike the sweatshops, there's no moral outcry for people who are incarcerated having to do work. I mean, the general consciousness is that, well, they're in prison. They should be made to do whatever they make them do. So these corporations have tied on to that, and they figured out, okay, I can get in this system. I can pay people next to nothing and work them incredibly any way I want to, and no, there's not going to be any moral outcry. So they flooded the market to come to these institutions. And in California, for example, they have the joint venture program where corporations are given tremendous tax breaks to set up factories on prison grounds and to employ prisoners, paying them virtually nothing, and even working them, having no limits on what they can subscribe these people to. For example, Dell Computer, one of the companies that signed on to the joint venture program at Cochran State Prison in California, they lost a class action lawsuit just a couple of years ago because they had two inmates working 20-hour days in completely unsanitary and unsafe conditions assembling computers. So this is the type of thing that appeals to the corporations, and this is the thing that fuels this prison industrial complex. And you're right. I mean, an overwhelming majority of people in prison are black and brown because, again, when you incarcerate these people, there isn't going to be a moral outcry because for a lot of people, the minute they see black and brown people, they're criminalized. So them being in prison isn't anything that's going to make them see anything out of the ordinary. So the system just runs on that way. Well,
let's talk about the outrage that's necessary. And it's a shame that it's taking so long for this to appear, but that's the nature of the thing. So let's take a look at the fact that there are more than 60% of the people in prison are racial and ethnic minorities. Let's start with that. For black males in their 20s, 1 in 8 is in prison or jail on any given day, and this is intensified by the disproportionate impact of the war on drugs, where 3/4 of all people in prison for drug offenses are people of color. Now, you talked about joint ventures. I consider it to be a joint RICO. When you consider that those jobs that are being created within prison walls and the people that are being worked for substandard income and conditions, and they have to compete with jobs that could be created outside those walls, which could employ people at union rates, how awake do we have to be to realize that there's something really sick about this system?
Well, I think the way this system works, the capitalist system works, is that people are just numbed to any sensitivity to the suffering that's going on around them, and we're all programmed to just focus on our individual lives, our families, our houses, our jobs, and that sort of thing. So, that's where people's consciousness is. So as long as it's not nothing out of the ordinary is happening, as long as they're not being pulled over by the police, they're not concerned. As long as they're not being foreclosed on, they're not concerned. As long as none of their family members are being falsely imprisoned or subject to these exploitative conditions in prison, they're not concerned about it. And so that's what, as long as they're not the ones having to go to war, they're not concerned. So that's the process, that programming process that allows the system to flourish without any massive outcry against it. As long as Who Wants to Marry a Millionaire is on, then that's what people are focused on, and the NBA Finals, and these things we're talking about are not things in people's minds.
Well, it seems like the modern media is more like the opiate of the masses more than anything else. So let's go back to the idea of activism. What do you think activists should do to address this problem?
Well, I think the main thing that we have to do is get people involved in the struggle for social justice. People have to, there are tons of organizations out here, but most people are not in any of them. And that's the problem. We have to get people engaged in the process to challenge the power structure. So, we don't focus on telling people what they need to think and where they need to engage in action. We just want people to engage whatever way they feel comfortable. Like, people can hear this and they can say, well, I'm sick of him talking. I don't like that Occupy movement. I don't like that All African People's Revolutionary Party. And that's fine if that's what they feel. Then they should start the I don't like that guy on the radio organization and recruit members and organize whatever way they can for justice. And whatever skills people have. If people are musicians, then they need to play music that's advancing the struggle. If they're writers, they need to do what I'm doing and write stories that talk about social justice issues. They need to do all of these things so that we create a culture of resistance. And once we do that, then we can change anything that happens. But that's what I think as activists we have to do is light that fire and get people engaged in the process.
So once again, I want you to be very specific. Describe the methods in which you approach political organizing and activism, and how do you see your efforts assisting in promoting political, economic, and social justice?
Well, one of the things I do is engage in activities like I have a discussion series that I facilitate now. And the purpose of that, and community members come to it, and the purpose of it is to provide people with information about the types of things that should happen in the society to provide them with the resources they need to advance their lives, and to give people a knowledge of, okay, this is how free health care works. This is how it benefits me. This is how free education would benefit me. Giving people that information and engaging people in a discussion about it and helping people understand ways in which we can organize to make that happen. Doing that. And then also, like I said, in terms of writing, my book is called Find the Flower That Blossoms. And it's a story about the issues we're talking about. Putting that kind of literature out there so that people have it and they read it. People are reading the book all over the world and writing me and talking about how it inspires them to think, about things they can do to make life better for themselves and others. So, again, doing something every day to contribute to this culture of resistance and engaging people on a consistent, ongoing basis in promoting positive ideas. Because if you think about it, the majority of people, when they get together for family functions or when they meet with their partners or whatever, or interact with their children, a lot of that is not based on positive principles and environment. It's based on making ends meet, making money, the pressure of the capitalist system. And these are, the values that are being promoted instead of how we can support each other, how we can nurture and encourage each other and create a positive society. So those are the things that, I'm engaged in doing every day with people, and that I implore all activists to do is have study groups, discussion groups, engage in community action groups, anything to give people a positive spirit and a sense that we can make change.
Beautifully put. And I hate to tell you this, but we've reached the end of our 15 minutes of fact, even though I think we've fudged that time frame just a little bit because of the value of what you have to say and the subject that is at hand. So what I'd like to tell our listeners is that you can reach Ashjamu Umi directly at umifam, that's UMIFAM, @gmail.com, or by way of his website, abetterworld.me. And Amjad, I'd like to have you complete our show today and let people know perhaps where you got your inspiration and the things that you've read so that we can set them in a particular direction that you found to be of value.
Well, the primary motivation for me was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X at age 16. And again, just, a story of someone who overcame the odds and became a person who used his negative experiences to engage in positive social change. And I've used him as my model my entire life. And that's what people need to do, is find something to encourage them to become protectors of justice and people who forge forward for a positive future.
And this is Jerry Ashton thanking Amjad Umi so much for the time that we've invested today in learning about the prison reform movement that's necessary, how to be able to get there, some of the tools that are in place, and it only needs your hands, your heart to go to work. Jerry Ashton signing off for WGRNradio.com and 15 Minutes of Fact.